Imagine this for a second. You walk into your first day at Harvard or Yale in the 1950s, nervous about classes, only to be told to strip naked for a photo session. Sounds like a bad dream, right? But from the late 1800s into the 1970s, elite universities actually took nude body photos of their students. Administrators claimed these images were about posture and health, but in 1940, psychologist William Sheldon saw something more. He turned them into raw material for his theory that body shape could reveal personality, a claim that would ripple through science and culture. We'll explore how this began, starting with the strange health obsession behind posture photos themselves. The strange origins of posture photos. Why did some of the most prestigious colleges in the country decide that photographing students without clothes was the key to keeping them healthy? At first it sounds absurd, but at the turn of the 20th century, posture was treated as a serious public health concern. Doctors and educators believed slouching or poor spinal alignment could lead to everything from back pain to decreased stamina. In the context of the First World War and later conflicts, worries about military readiness also fed into this fixation. If young men had weak posture, the reasoning went, they might not pass muster for national service. Against that backdrop, schools began presenting posture examinations as a modern, science-based safeguard. Medical knowledge at the time often leaned on visible external measurements to make sweeping claims about health. Many physicians thought that the way someone stood, walked, or carried themselves could act as an early warning sign of more serious conditions. Universities, eager to project themselves as leaders in scientific thinking, found posture photography appealing. The process looked clinical, the equipment felt modern, and the records fit neatly into a belief that health could be managed by careful observation. For administrators, these photos weren't just about fixing a student's slouch. They represented a vision of producing graduates who looked as polished and disciplined as they were educated. Harvard was among the earliest adopters of these posture programs. By the early 20th century, posture examinations had become part of student health checks at the university. Over the following decades, similar programs spread across Ivy League campuses, and by the 1940s through the 1970s, they appeared at women's colleges such as the Seven Sisters schools as well. Once one institution implemented the practice, others quickly followed. No school wanted to look old-fashioned when it came to student health. The result was a system in which large cohorts of incoming freshmen were photographed and catalogued year after year. The process itself was standardized. Students were brought into controlled environments, often assigned identical poses, and lined up so photographs could capture their posture from consistent angles. These weren't personal keepsakes. They were medical records stored by the institution, often disappearing into archives where clinicians and educators could review them. The scale of this effort meant that storage rooms filled steadily with images, creating vast collections of visual data on young adults who never thought much beyond the immediate oddness of posing. Most students complied without protest, largely because refusing never felt like a real option. Universities at this time carried immense authority in students' lives. If a dean or physician explained that posture photos were essential for health monitoring, that was justification enough. Consent was not formally requested, and questions of privacy rarely surfaced, not when the practice was framed as scientific record-keeping for one's own benefit. For new students eager to belong, there was little thought given to challenging the request. Looking back now, the serious tone surrounding these assessments stands in sharp contrast to how we might perceive them. Administrators and doctors approached the photos as hard data, tools meant to classify and correct bodily alignment. Yet to a modern eye, the rituals echo something more intrusive. Young people, nervous and unclothed, asked to expose themselves under the authority of their institution. The fact that programs existed for decades highlights not only the breadth of the practice, but also how easily it blended into campus tradition. Once the habit had taken root, it seemed ordinary. Freshman orientation included health checks. Health checks included posture evaluations. Posture evaluations included the photo. And because universities presented the process as routine, its invasive nature slipped largely unnoticed. Institutions justified year after year of collections in the language of care, discipline, and educational duty. The posture programs became entrenched, an annual ritual that reinforced the idea that surveillance of the body was a form of scientific progress. Over time, the body of material preserved in these archives grew to enormous proportions. What began as narrow health monitoring had produced a photographic record of thousands of students, spanning multiple generations. The data no longer amounted to individual health snapshots, but functioned as a massive, unpublished visual catalogue of physical variation. In hindsight, the very existence of such an archive carried risks. Once stored under the control of universities, these images could be opened to new interpretations far beyond posture correction. That's the hinge in this story. Posture photos made sense only as long as they served the narrow definition of medical records, but bound in files across elite universities, they became tempting for others to reinterpret, not as evidence of spinal curvature, but as something far larger. And they soon would be. Those files didn't remain medical records for long. One psychologist turned them into a different kind of science. William Sheldon enters the picture. The figure who brought this new direction into focus was William Herbert Sheldon. Trained first as a medical doctor and later as a psychologist, Sheldon was ambitious, credentialed, and convinced that the human body held hidden clues to character. In the 1940s, he started publishing major works on body types, culminating in 1954 with the Atlas of Men**. These books gave his theories scientific shape, and they were built on a premise that captured both academic and public imagination. Physical form, he argued, was tied directly to personality. For Sheldon, the nude posture photographs archived at universities were not inconsequential medical files at all. They were raw data, tens of thousands of standardized images that could be sorted, scored, and aligned into a grand system linking body to mind. Sheldon came of age in the early 20th century, during a period when eugenic ideas were embedded in mainstream science. Concepts like measuring skulls, charting body proportions, or equating physical traits with intelligence and morality were regularly taught in universities. Although criticism of eugenics grew after the Second World War, Sheldon clung to a belief that biology could be mapped into categories as neatly as chemical elements. He wasn't satisfied with general impressions. He aimed to build a comprehensive catalogue that promised predictive power. In his mind, a person's build was more than appearance. It was an index of temperament, ambition, and even moral fiber. This approach became what he called constitutional psychology. Its central claim was bold in its simplicity. Body type revealed temperament. The width of a chest, the curve of the belly, the length of arms and legs were not just attributes but indicators of personality. Every individual, he argued, could be placed into a framework that forecast emotional makeup and behavioral style. In the 1940s and 1950s, such a system seemed compelling. It turned the uncertainty of human character into something visible, measurable, and supposedly objective. For audiences eager for clarity in the aftermath of global conflict and social upheaval, Sheldon's tidy categories promised answers delivered by science. The cultural timing mattered. War, depression, and upheaval had left societies eager for reliable ways to classify and predict behavior. Psychology as a discipline still struggled for the prestige enjoyed by medicine or physics. A theory that insisted body shape correlated with character seemed like progress, an advance that replaced guesswork with observation and numbers. Sheldon's confidence in his system made it sound less like speculation and more like discovery. When he spoke or wrote, it was with the authority of someone uncovering natural law. His somatotype charts and measurement systems came across as orderly, modern, and persuasive to both students and professionals. At the center of his system were the somatotypes, three body categories tied to embryological development. Endomorphs were rounded, heavier, associated by Sheldon with sociability and comfort-seeking. Mesomorphs were muscular, broad, linked in his theory to aggression and assertiveness. Ectomorphs were thinner, narrow, connected to sensitivity and introversion. Though he emphasized that most people could be described as blends scored along scales, the appeal lay in how quickly the categories converted flesh into forecast. By calculating ratios, Sheldon claimed he could define a person's balance of traits, a system that made identity seem like a number waiting to be uncovered. But theories require evidence, and Sheldon needed material on a vast scale. Posture photographs collected under the guise of medical assessment provided exactly that. Standardized poses, consistent lighting, unadorned bodies. These images gave Sheldon a dataset unlike any other. He eventually gained access to photographs from multiple institutions, sometimes through correspondence, sometimes through collaborations or archival agreements. Letters between him and schools like Vassar document how this access was negotiated. The result was an archive of tens of thousands of nude student photographs, appropriated into research projects far beyond the students' knowledge or consent. For the young adults photographed, the situation was starkly different. They believed their images were taken to assess back curvature or physical fitness, records tucked away in health files. Consent was never obtained for psychological study, let alone for reclassification into categories of personality. By today's standards, the intrusion is obvious, but even at the time, the leap from posture evaluation to personality mapping was far outside what any student had been told. Universities that permitted Sheldon access to their archives blurred the line between health surveillance and research exploitation, turning a medical procedure into fuel for a controversial psychology. Sheldon promoted his work with conviction. In publications and lectures, he presented his somatotypes as discoveries backed by massive datasets. He implied that his findings could guide everything from education to hiring, even predicting leadership qualities or criminal susceptibility. To administrators and funders looking for clear systems to evaluate human potential, this certainty was tempting. Suddenly, anonymous undergraduates photographed in their first semester were reimagined as evidence for laws of character. Journalists spread the catchy framework, and magazines explained how body outlines revealed inner truth. Constitutional psychology gained traction, not only in academic circles but in popular culture, where it seemed an easy shortcut to knowing someone at a glance. When viewed today, the claims feel both simplistic and invasive. The suggestion that abdominal shape dictated temperament, or that muscularity explained dominance, reduces individuality to caricature. Imagine a job interview where your shoulders are silently being read as signs of aggression, or a social encounter where someone assumes your appetite is evident in your waistline. The humor in picturing such jumps highlights the absurdity, but it cannot soften the ethical breach at the system's core. Real students under authority were turned into unwitting subjects in a classification scheme that stripped privacy and reshaped identity. Sheldon's ambitions stretched even further with his atlases. These large volumes, organized with photos and scales, sought to present definitive references on the human form and its supposed psychological correlates. In 1954, the Atlas of Men put his theory into print, displaying nude male photographs as exemplars of somatotypes. He hoped to create similar collections for women. The indexing looked scientific, images laid side by side, measured, numbered, but it carried echoes of older racial and eugenic catalogues, where bodies had been arrayed to prove hierarchy. Sheldon may have thought of himself as modernizing psychology, but his method reinscribed old judgments in statistical clothing. The ethical problems were amplified by scale. Tens of thousands of students, images were pulled into a vision they had never endorsed. The imbalance was sharp. Respected institutions opened collections to a determined psychologist, while young people, many barely out of adolescence, were silent participants, their trust in their universities misplaced. What had been presented as posture correction quietly morphed into a foundation for sweeping claims about morality, criminality, and achievement. Sheldon's personal style reinforced the problem. Critics existed, but his certainty and his piles of evidence gave him cover. With precise charts, mathematical scales, and confident language, he brushed aside objections. To many, the sheer weight of his images suggested scientific justification. It made questioning him harder in an era when psychology was trying to prove itself as rigorous and quantitative. Somatotypes seemed like a clean science of human nature, valid enough for classrooms and textbooks. Yet the consequences went beyond faulty categories. The system erased individuality, making students into specimens. It ignored culture, environment, choice, factors essential to personality. It disregarded privacy entirely, treating bodies captured under one purpose as material for another. What began in gyms and infirmaries as health records had been redirected into books that made sweeping declarations about human potential. The reach of constitutional psychology lay not in its scientific foundation, but in its appeal. The suggestion that who you are could be known instantly by how you looked. That appeal ensured influence beyond academia. Magazines turned somatotypes into digestible charts for everyday readers. Employers and educators were drawn to its clear judgments, and even law enforcement entertained the idea that criminality might be forecast in the body. By the time tens of thousands of photographs had been poured into Sheldon's system, the lines between science and stereotype were blurred. And the unsettling part is how easily it happened, not through coercion of students, but through routine medical practices redirected by a confident theorist. The question that lingers, then, is not only about what Sheldon believed, but how his framework gained traction. Why did simplified categories of endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph seem so persuasive to so many? How did these nude clinical photos become the raw material for a scheme that claimed bodies equal minds? The seductive simplicity of somatotypes. The reason Sheldon's system spread so quickly had less to do with solid science and more to do with its deceptive neatness. It offered a world where personality could be sketched out simply by looking at the body. To a public craving shortcuts, that was a compelling promise. Instead of facing the ambiguity of psychological testing or individual complexity, someone could supposedly grasp a person's temperament at a glance. Sheldon called these broad divisions somatotypes, and he described 3 of them with terms that sounded clinical but were easy to picture. Endomorphs were rounder and softer, Mesomorphs muscular and broad, Ectomorphs narrow and lean. Alongside those physical sketches, Sheldon tied corresponding psychological scripts. The endomorph was imagined as sociable and relaxed, the mesomorph as confident and dominant, the ectomorph as sensitive and withdrawn. In one stroke, shapes of flesh became shapes of character. What made the system appear distinctive was the addition of numbers. Sheldon insisted people were rarely pure examples of one type, so he created a 3-number scale ranging from 1 to 7 for each category: endomorph, mesomorph, ectomorph. A person could be coded as, say, 462, supposedly representing a mix tilted toward muscularity. On the surface, this looked precise, almost mathematical, but in practice, these scores were not derived from exact measurements. They were largely visual judgments made by raters comparing body images, leaving the process subjective and inconsistent. By dressing guesswork in numerical clothing, Sheldon gave the impression of scientific accuracy without the rigor to support it. This scoring system turned his charts and photographs into what seemed like a structured database. People are inclined to trust numbers, and seeing combinations like 354 or 712 made the theory feel quantifiable. It offered the aura of objectivity, while masking the fact that the underlying evaluations were based on personal interpretation. To readers in the 1940s and 1950s, the idea of reducing personality to a numerical code carried modern appeal. Psychological complexity could be made legible in the same way as a medical test or statistical survey. The simplicity was seductive because it converted something intangible into a visible, trackable system. Part of the attraction lay in how familiar this kind of classification felt. People have long embraced tools that promise to decode personality through easy categories. Just as horoscopes link star signs to human traits, somatotypes boiled life experience down to body outline. Just as modern personality tests online sort people into broad types with a handful of questions, Sheldon's model asked only that you look in a mirror. The cultural climate of the mid-20th century, marked by industrial change and unease after world wars, only amplified the appetite for certainty. In periods of disorder, a framework that organizes people into 3 clear groups with coded scores has obvious appeal. The media extended his reach far beyond academic circles. Lifestyle magazines ran spreads framed almost like entertainment, suggesting body shape could reveal patterns in dating or professional promise. Articles carried lines about how readers might discover hidden truths in the projection of their shoulders or waist. Even though serious psychologists debated the validity of such claims, the neatness of Sheldon's divisions made them easy to present to general audiences. Readers didn't need scientific training to participate. They simply matched themselves to the descriptions, attaching personality to physique without questioning the premise. This accessibility was also what made it so problematic. Each category carried judgments shaped by cultural biases of the time. Endomorphs, often heavier, were portrayed as more indulgent or lacking discipline, signals of a society that prized thinness as moral control. Mesomorphs, celebrated for their musculature, were cast as decisive leaders, reflecting traditional admiration for physical strength. Ectomorphs, presented as frail and nervous, echoed stereotypes of intellectuals as disconnected and overly sensitive. What looked like scientific discovery was, in reality, a mirror of social attitudes given academic framing. The labels reinforced old stereotypes under the guise of new insight. When taken to extremes, the absurdity becomes clear. Imagine being told your tendency to succeed at work was best demonstrated by your shoulder width, or that your capacity for empathy could be read from your abdomen. These leaps exposed the flaws, yet at the time, they were respected in more than casual settings. To laugh at them today is to miss that real opportunities were affected. Students, job applicants, and recruits were judged by frameworks that owed more to cultural storytelling than empirical study. The fingerprints of this desire for simplification still exist. In modern culture, personality shorthand continues to attract attention, whether in phone apps that map birth charts, personality type quizzes shared on social media, or love language assessments that circulate as guides for relationships. Few of these pass serious scientific scrutiny, yet they remain popular because they give complex realities a sense of order. Sheldon's somatotypes were an early scientific-sounding ancestor of this phenomenon. The main difference was that his categories were reinforced not just by magazines or entertainment, but also by the credibility of academic institutions. This institutional embrace gave the system a weight far beyond novelty. Universities, researchers, and sometimes government programs acknowledged the categories in ways that signaled they were more than opinion. When a framework moves from private amusement to official application, it shapes real environments. Hiring committees, military selectors, or teachers could easily allow stereotypes about body type to tint their evaluations, often without realizing how much bias was imported from Sheldon's publications. Instead of harmless curiosity, the system became another route for discrimination. The durability of those stereotypes is visible in the cultural characters that persist: the athletic leader, the nervous thinker, the carefree but unserious heavier friend. These images did not arise by accident. Somatotype theory gave them a vocabulary and handed them academic weight. Once printed in textbooks and medical atlases, they became harder to dismiss. Decades later, even after the theories were discredited, the appeal of these character sketches stuck in public imagination. Cultural habits often outlast the science that inspired them. The elegance of the structure, 3 types, 3 number codes, simple correlations, was what allowed these ideas to spread so widely. It made the categories feel like a scientific discovery rather than a cultural opinion. But the same features that made the system tidy also masked its emptiness. Reducing all personality to a few body types did not reveal hidden lore. It offered little more than stereotypes in numerical disguise. This contradiction, clear, confident claims masking weak evidence, was at the heart of what made somatotypes simultaneously attractive and dangerous. That danger lay particularly in how the system crossed from personal fascination into formal environments. Once attached to the prestige of science, somatotyping became more than a conversation piece. It guided judgments and justified assumptions, even when the evidence was thin. And it gained that position not simply because Sheldon was persuasive, but because institutions opened their doors and granted his approach legitimacy. Understanding how that happened requires looking at the role of universities themselves in advancing his framework, and the choices they made when granting access to their students, most private records. When pseudoscience hijacks institutions, how could universities, places trusted to teach, protect, and guide, become the enablers of one man's dubious psychological crusade? The answer lies in how easily authority lends credibility, even when it is misplaced. What began as health files stored in gym basements or campus clinics became something very different once William Sheldon came calling. He offered administrators the language of scientific innovation. Archived letters show that some colleges cooperated directly with him, arranging access to posture photographs, sometimes without any attempt to secure student consent. With that approval, Sheldon gained a treasure trove of material no independent researcher could have assembled on his own. A procedure designed to correct posture slippage was quietly rebranded into data for mapping personality. The scale of participation makes the story even more startling. This wasn't a side project surveying a handful of students, it was an industrial pipeline. Every fall, a new cohort of undergraduates walked through health offices and lined up against backdrops. By mid-century, schools had created vast archives, tens of thousands of nude photographs stored in cabinets and film reels. For Sheldon's team, this represented a near census of young, educated Americans, organized with mechanical efficiency. Each freshman filing in for posture checks unwittingly supplied another entry for a database they never knew existed. No signature lines, no warnings, no opportunity to refuse. What looked routine was in fact silent participation in a form of research they would only recognize decades later. Consent, or the absence of it, is the sharpest point of failure. Even allowing for looser norms of the mid-20th century, students had no reason to imagine their bodies were being drafted into psychology. They trusted that the exercise was medical routine, a box ticked before starting classes. Administrators knew better, or at least had reason to pause, but they deferred instead. Sheldon was persuasive, carried prestigious credentials, and spoke the language of science in a way that reassured campus leaders they were backing progress. The students, reliant on the authority figures who governed their education, had no leverage to resist. That power imbalance turned health photographs into research subjects without acknowledgement, an appropriation masked by the silence of official paperwork. What gave the arrangement an even harder edge was the cloak of institutional prestige. To outsiders, the fact that Ivy League and 7 sister schools were associated with the research added instant legitimacy. Families, fellow academics, and funders assumed that any project passing through those gates must be tightly monitored. In reality, there was little oversight at all. Sheldon's theories carried forward under the weight of university reputations, not under the weight of evidence. Undergraduates, too intimidated to challenge procedures, simply followed instructions. Faculty who might have objected refrained, either because the process seemed minor or because rejecting a science-based initiative risked appearing reactionary. In this way, elite brand names silenced the skepticism that might have stopped the project in its tracks. To illustrate the absurdity, imagine Sheldon as curator of the strangest archive in America. Instead of capturing students with their clubs and triumphs, administrators and researchers assembled an invisible yearbook that reduced each body to angles and temperament codes. Every photo became a candid stripped of context, captioned not with achievements but with stereotypes. The result was chilling rather than celebratory. What had been framed as routine posture documentation amounted to surveillance conducted under the institutional stamp of care. The contrast between expectation and reality: students believed they were in health exams, while Sheldon treated them as psychological specimens, emphasizes how misplaced trust enabled the whole scheme. Once incorporated into his theories, these photos became data. Manuscripts and atlases carried graphs and charts based on hundreds of images. Readers, seeing tidy bar graphs and coded scales, assumed objectivity where there was none. Sheldon's numbers appeared precise but were built on subjective ratings of physique. The appearance of quantification concealed the fact that participants had neither agreed nor even been informed. But because the data was voluminous and linked to high-prestige universities, the foundation looked solid. It was a collage of coerced, unaware participation paraded as scientific rigor. Many of Sheldon's peers accepted his results anyway, and not simply out of laziness. The conclusions ratified cultural biases already familiar. Muscular men coded as dominant leaders, heavier individuals associated with softness and indulgence, thin figures tied to nervous intellect. Because these archetypes echoed stereotypes entrenched in mid-century culture, the data looked plausible. Confirmation bias bound the profession to his work. Critiquing Sheldon risked not just singling out a charismatic psychologist, but also calling into question the decisions of Ivy League staff who cooperated. That double shield, cultural cliché and academic backing, kept dissent at bay. Letters preserved from college archives show that Sheldon's collaboration was not universal or perfectly smooth. Some institutions facilitated his requests, even arranging shipments of materials. Others grew uneasy or established stricter limitations. And many years later, when alumni discovered the true purposes for which their photos had been used, some schools destroyed their archives outright. Vassar, for example, burned its collection after a 1995 exposé reignited anger over how the images had been handled. This variability matters because it undercuts the notion of a neat conspiracy. Instead, the story is one of uneven cooperation, of some administrators signing papers out of eagerness, while others resisted or later tried to erase their involvement. The public exposure of Sheldon's female photographs underscores how difficult the arrangement would eventually become to defend. By the late 1940s and into 1950, reports about the use of women's posture photos began to draw criticism. The University of Washington faced backlash after revelations that nude female portraits had been repurposed for research without consent. That early wave of discomfort foreshadowed much larger scandal. Decades later, when details resurfaced in print journalism during the 1990s, outrage was sharper, reflecting a cultural shift toward demanding privacy and accountability. The 1995 article that publicized Sheldon's use of the archives not only tarnished old reputations, but triggered the destruction of tens of thousands of photographs across campuses. By then, the theories were long out of favor scientifically, but the anger revealed the emotional cost of those who realized their youthful compliance had been twisted into participation in pseudoscience. The trajectory reveals how pseudoscience flourishes when institutions grant their seal of approval. Sheldon's system may not have convinced skeptics on its own, but when framed by Ivy League cooperation, it marched into mainstream lectures, textbooks, and magazine spreads. Without that borrowed prestige, somatotypes might have been an oddity relegated to fringe psychology. With it, they were normalized, exported, and amplified. The lesson is simple: pseudoscience doesn't conquer by merit. It colonizes authority structures and thrives by exploiting misplaced trust. For students at the time, none of this was visible. They walked into examinations thinking they had completed a tedious but harmless ritual. For decades, they carried no awareness that their bodies had been coded into psychological systems. Only much later did the truth flicker into view, first in scattered campus controversies, later in national headlines. The cost of delayed outrage was that somatotypes had already sunk into cultural soil and started bearing fruit in arenas far beyond the academy. The photographs, once boxes of film and paper, were eventually transferred into bound atlases and professional presentations. From there, they crossed into wider circulation. By the time the archives were destroyed and discredited, the images had left their mark in published works and taught assumptions. The destruction of remaining collections in the 1990s curtailed further scholarship, but could not erase the path those ideas had taken. The photos no longer sat in university vaults, but their influence lingered in classrooms, workplaces, and media that adopted their logic without question. The unsettling reality is that pseudoscience rarely stays confined to the lecture hall once it has been given official approval. It leaves, it travels, and it plants stereotypes into ordinary habits. How far those ideas went, and how deeply they shaped cultural expectations, becomes the next part of the story. From lecture halls to job interviews. Did Sheldon's somatotype categories stay confined to classrooms and research papers, or did they move into everyday choices and perceptions? This question matters because it marks the difference between a failed psychological theory and something that quietly shaped the way people were judged in their ordinary lives. Once ideas like these escape academia, they don't just vanish when scientists stop endorsing them. They creep into workplaces, cultural scripts, and casual assumptions. In the case of somatotypes, the framework seeped into hiring logic, clinical profiling, and popular media, informing stereotypes, and even feeding into some informal screening practices long after the theory itself lost credibility. By the 1950s, American workplaces already placed heavy emphasis on appearance and presentation as signs of competence. Suits were pressed, hair neatly trimmed, bodies expected to project stamina. It was a business culture that valued not just results but the right look for the role. Sheldon's framework offered a ready-made vocabulary for those unspoken preferences. Without being written into any official policy, managers and recruiters absorbed its archetypes. The Mesomorph, muscular, confident, exuding command, matched the post-war corporate ideal of decisive leadership. The Ectomorph, often coded as cerebral but nervous, was seen as better suited for behind-the-scenes analysis rather than visible management. And endomorphs, judged unfairly as softer or lacking discipline, struggled to be slotted into competitive corporate imagery. None of these stereotypes required HR manuals to spread. They operated informally, shaping meetings, interview impressions, and training brochures. Recruitment was only one space where this mindset showed up. Broader fields, like psychology, education, and even aspects of government service, borrowed from Sheldon's categories. In criminal justice and criminological circles, body type theories were occasionally referenced as part of attempts to profile risk. The notion that muscular individuals were more prone to aggression, or that thin, wiry figures suggested nervous instability, echoed through mid-century criminology. While there is little evidence of centralized or official adoption in agencies like the FBI, Sheldon's claims bled into discussions already influenced by older traditions linking physique to criminality. It wasn't systematic policy, but certain practitioners and evaluators took such ideas seriously, adding weight to circular reasoning. Stereotypes reinforced Sheldon, and Sheldon lent those stereotypes the appearance of science. Popular culture magnified those patterns in its own way. Hollywood leaned heavily on somatotype tropes, turning psychological theory into stock character roles. The broad-shouldered hero embodied courage and decisiveness. The wiry thinker, awkward and eccentric, provided comic contrast or bookish expertise. The heavier figure, cast as warm but unserious, was confined to supporting roles or played for humor. Advertising and magazines did the same, presenting modern manhood in lean, athletic bodies suited for leadership. Even comic books borrowed these archetypes, styling heroes and sidekicks in line with Sheldon's categories. By the time audiences absorbed enough of these portrayals, the original source barely mattered. People acted as if the categories were common sense, never realizing how directly they mapped back to a debunked classification scheme. The workplace examples are telling in their subtlety. Oral histories from the 1950s and 1960s describe hiring managers who tallied personal fitness as part of judging an applicant's promise. Descriptions of ideal candidates often focused on physical cues, stature, weight, confidence in posture, rather than strictly on skill. Broad-shouldered applicants, for example, were thought to project managerial authority. Larger or heavier applicants were sometimes written off as less disciplined before their resumes were fully considered. Training advertisements amplified the same pattern, displaying slim, commanding men in tailored suits as the visual shorthand for modern business readiness. These choices weren't accidents. They were translations of somatotype assumptions into workplace visuals, showing how theories can insinuate themselves even without explicit endorsement. Even outside employment, the logic carried into schools, sports assessments, and personality evaluations. Students with wiry builds might be pushed toward academic tracks that aligned with the sensitive intellectual stereotype, while more muscular classmates were encouraged to lead teams or join activities coded as physically assertive. Heavier students faced the flip side of that bias, often underestimated in both classroom and extracurricular spaces. None of this was written into laws or policies, yet the repetition of stereotypes gave them teeth. The categories followed individuals through formative years, quietly influencing opportunities. What makes this persistence especially striking is how echoes of these ideas still appear in the present. Weight bias and height bias are well documented in modern hiring research. Taller men, on average, still receive higher salaries, while candidates perceived as overweight report higher rates of discrimination, regardless of qualifications. Recruiters, often without realizing it, link athletic builds with competence and leadership potential. This is not because anyone is citing William Sheldon in HR offices. It's because the mindsets he helped popularize were folded into cultural reflexes. Once stereotypes become habits, they continue long after their original justification is forgotten. Psychology offers an explanation in the halo effect, the tendency to assume that someone perceived as attractive, fit, or confident physically must also excel in intelligence, responsibility, or leadership. Employers making quick, instinctive judgments often default to these shortcuts. What Sheldon's theories did was give those unconscious leaps a pseudo-academic framework. Even now, when constitutional psychology has long been discredited, its mark lingers in the way snap estimates are made about who seems capable or reliable. No one references somatotypes explicitly, but the reflex acts as if they still apply, sliding beneath professional language about team fit and leadership qualities. Highlighting the absurdity can make the problem clearer. Imagine a job posting stating openly, preferred candidates, muscular mesomorphs exuding confidence, ideally with visible athleticism. The text is laughable precisely because overt discrimination is unacceptable, yet the bias it reflects operates beneath the surface. Hiring remains skewed toward bodies that look the part. What is treated as instinctive good judgment is often the unspoken inheritance of a pseudoscience once taught in lecture halls. Consequences ripple beyond unfair treatment of individuals. Once stereotypes guide decisions, even subtly, they reinforce inequalities. A mesomorphic frame, favored consciously or unconsciously in leadership positions, turns visibility and opportunity into a self-fulfilling loop. Heavier applicants or those outside the favored mold face repeated exclusion, and their absence from leadership roles is then cited as proof the stereotype was accurate. Structural bias masquerades as natural order. In practice, it is a cycle that rewards conformity to a body ideal at the cost of merit and diversity. By the latter half of the 20th century, the theory of somatotypes was collapsing scientifically, but the stereotypes it propagated were embedded in culture. Employers, teachers, and media creators didn't need to cite William Sheldon anymore. They simply acted on inherited assumptions. Popular culture kept replaying the mesomorphic hero, the ectomorphic intellectual, the endomorphic comic relief. These familiar roles outlived their original academic foundation. The silence surrounding their origins made them even harder to challenge, as they seemed like common cultural sense rather than artifacts of contested science. Even so, somatotype ideas have not disappeared entirely from technical practice. While constitutional psychology was thoroughly discredited as a theory of personality, a modified system called the Heath-Carter method carried forward some of its language. In fitness science and physical anthropology, terms like endomorph, mesomorph, and ectomorph survived as shorthand for physique assessment, stripped of their psychological baggage. Trainers and researchers still use the words sparingly to describe body proportions in sport or growth studies, not to predict temperament. This survival explains why the language feels oddly familiar today, even when most people have never heard of Sheldon himself. The categories lived on in limited scientific niches, keeping the vocabulary alive in everyday speech. Ultimately, the endurance of somatotype thinking shows how easily pseudoscience mutates into culture. A failed theory can vanish academically yet persist as bias, stereotype, and casual categorization for generations. Sheldon's classifications never earned scientific legitimacy, but they played into existing prejudices deeply enough to become habits. Once ingrained, those habits shape interviews, social judgments, and cultural archetypes without reference to the original books that spawned them. Still, theories that embed themselves so pervasively don't last forever. The same institutions that once gave Sheldon access to archives eventually became focal points of ethical scandal and public outrage. As norms shifted and more people scrutinized the origins of these practices, the foundation of constitutional psychology began to unravel. And with growing resistance, in science, politics, and public opinion, the question arose: what finally caused Sheldon's edifice of body-type psychology to collapse? The collapse of a dangerous idea. Sheldon's framework did not vanish overnight. It unraveled piece by piece as different pressures converged. What once looked like a confident path-breaking theory came under attack from multiple directions. Public outrage over the misuse of student photographs, whistleblowers exposing flawed methods, shifting medical opinion that stripped away its legitimacy, and the backdrop of post-war politics that turned suspicion against any system of biological determinism. Together, these forces chipped away at his credibility until the entire structure collapsed. One of the earliest sparks came from students themselves. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, young women in particular began voicing discomfort over the use of their posture photographs. At the University of Washington, where Sheldon had obtained images of female students, protests pushed administrators into a corner. Some of those photographs were seized and destroyed after complaints mounted. The fact that nude images of women, taken under the guise of health checks, were being funneled into male-authored atlases provoked a level of scrutiny that colleges could no longer avoid. What had once been explained away as routine suddenly appeared exploitative, and the backlash opened the first visible breach in Sheldon's enterprise. The timing amplified the damage. In the wake of the Second World War, society had grown increasingly wary of deterministic systems that sorted people by body, race, or heredity. Eugenics, once widely taught, was disgraced by its association with authoritarian regimes and atrocities abroad. Sheldon insisted his system was psychology, not politics, but the parallels to eugenic thinking were never far from view. Classifying humans into fixed categories of biological worth invited comparisons many were unwilling to tolerate. The cultural climate after 1945 turned what might have seemed like a quirky classification scheme into something that smelled of older, dangerous ways of thinking. A science claiming that body shape revealed moral destiny felt out of step with a world newly sensitized to the risks of such determinism. Inside Sheldon's own circle came a second rupture. Barbara Hunneman Heath, who had worked alongside him, grew increasingly uneasy with his practices. She later disclosed that data had often been shaped to fit the theory, with inconsistent scores adjusted until they matched his expectations. The precision of his three-number somatotype scale, so central to the appearance of objectivity, was, according to Heath, less the result of strict measurement and more a matter of interpretive judgment, sometimes even manipulation. For critics of constitutional psychology, her testimony confirmed long-held suspicions. The tidy charts were not evidence of natural law, they were imposed order, made credible only by selectively including data that cooperated. This accusation of falsification cut directly against Sheldon's reputation for rigor. Once the aura of objectivity cracked, the scaffolding of his system looked unreliable. Sheldon's publishing efforts also contributed to his undoing. His Atlas of Men *, 1954, had already stirred unease by presenting page after page of nude male photographs, stripped of context and reduced to type specimens. But when he attempted to produce an Atlas of Women *, controversy rose sharply. Legal risks, public outcry, and ethical questions multiplied. Some images circulated in limited form, but the project never came close to full release. For critics, that failure suggested not only the limits of Sheldon's credibility, but also a cultural turning point. Institutions that once tolerated male archives hesitated when it came to female students. The potential scandal of distributing nude images of women, many of them taken under compulsory circumstances, became untenable. The collapse of this second atlas foreshadowed the broader collapse of his framework. Meanwhile, the very medical roots of his enterprise were drying up. By the 1960s and 1970s, medical opinion had shifted decisively away from posture examinations. New evidence showed that slouching did not directly predict long-term health outcomes, let alone moral character. Poor posture mapped to muscle tension, furniture design, or temporary habits, not destiny. Chiropractors could benefit from the slouch of their patients, universities could not. Once doctors dismissed posture as an unreliable index of health, the original justification for taking the photos looked flimsy. If posture photos no longer served a meaningful medical role, their continued existence in university archives raised even sharper questions about consent and privacy. Sheldon's appropriation of those photos only multiplied the unease. Public awareness magnified the damage further. As newspapers and magazines picked up the story, whispers about secret archives gave way to outrage. Alumni discovered that images from their youth still sat in university vaults. By the 1960s, some of those former students had become public leaders, judges, politicians, prominent academics. The idea that their nude photographs had been dragged into psychological atlases without consent turned embarrassment into anger. Administrators who had quietly filed the images away suddenly faced pressure from some of their most powerful graduates. Protecting institutional reputation often meant destroying the evidence entirely. Posture photographs disappeared into bonfires, shredders, and dumpsters. Some universities sealed collections permanently. Others, like Vassar, destroyed theirs after renewed scandal in the 1990s, when a New York Times Magazine article exposed their lingering presence. The 1995 exposé was a late aftershock that underlined how lasting the shame had become. Though constitutional psychology had long been discredited scientifically, the revelation that tens of thousands of nude student images still existed forced institutions into damage control once again. Many chose to obliterate entire archives rather than risk legal exposure or public scandal. The firestorms that followed illustrated how deeply the project had violated trust. Had the material been truly scientific in purpose, universities might have preserved it for historical record. That they chose destruction instead was itself an admission. The foundations were indefensible. Confronted with mounting failures on every front, public, political, scientific, and personal, Sheldon's reputation dissolved. The neat promise of linking physique to personality no longer carried weight in academic psychology, which was shifting toward cognitive science, behavioral studies, and models that accounted for culture and learning. His work no longer appeared as daring or innovative, but as a relic, an echo of older, reductive sciences that prized classification over understanding. Without institutional support, his theories reverted to the margins. The collapse of posture programs at universities marked both the end of his direct influence and the recognition of how far institutions had allowed pseudoscience to bleed into the lives of their students. The symbolic lesson endured even after the details faded. Sheldon's fall represented the failure of biological determinism paraded as psychology. Theories that reduced identity to physique proved brittle in the face of more nuanced research. What lingered was not his method, but the warning it carried. How easily prejudice can wear the guise of science, and how quickly authority can be misused when administrators forget the obligations of consent. His downfall became a cautionary tale in research ethics classes, a reminder that methodological neatness means little when built on coercion, bias, or selective evidence. By the mid-1970s, posture photography had been abandoned at American colleges, the archives largely destroyed or sealed from view. Sheldon himself slipped quietly into the footnotes of psychology, his major works treated more as curiosities than as sources of serious theory. Yet as his influence shrank, questions remained for the wider culture. If the man and his system had been so thoroughly discredited, why did traces of his categories still show up in stereotypes, in movies, and even in subtle hiring biases? Why did the culture continue to cling to archetypes that body type revealed destiny, long after the science had been erased? That persistence turns out to be the most haunting part of the story. Sheldon's system collapsed, but the assumptions it amplified proved harder to kill. And to understand why body stereotypes proved so sticky, we have to examine not the institutions that spread them, but the psychology that makes people still believe them. Why body stereotypes still stick? Even with Sheldon's framework discredited decades ago, the stereotypes it leaned on continue to surface in everyday life. The endurance of body-based assumptions is not about evidence. They have been tested and debunked many times over. The deeper issue lies in why people still instinctively connect body shape with character long after the science was discarded. Cultural repetition and cognitive shortcuts make the stereotypes feel natural, even when we know they are false. What survives today is not Sheldon's theory itself, but the same mental habits that kept it persuasive in the first place. Part of this persistence comes from how the brain processes information. Human cognition relies on shortcuts, and those shortcuts distort our judgments. Confirmation bias is one of the strongest. Once we form an expectation that muscular people are assertive, for instance, we're more likely to notice and remember behavior that fits it. If a broad-shouldered man speaks confidently, the moment sticks because it confirms the stereotype. If he hesitates, we overlook it because it doesn't fit. Over time, this uneven attention creates the illusion of accuracy, reinforcing connections that were never reliable to begin with. Research has documented this effect for decades. In fact, a 1961 study by Wells and Siegel found that people reliably associated body shapes with personality traits, showing how such stereotypes operate independently of Sheldon or his theories. The data proved the point. Remove the academic branding and the bias remains. The halo effect adds another layer. This bias makes us assume attractive or physically fit traits indicate positive inequalities like confidence or success. Seeing someone athletic often convinces us they are disciplined or capable before we have any supporting evidence. In professional settings, this can mean hiring managers unconsciously favor tall or lean applicants, treating physique as a proxy for leadership. On dating apps, users swipe right when they see toned bodies, under the assumption that health reflects good character. Few people would say explicitly that muscle equals competence, yet behavior often reveals exactly that assumption. These patterns show how perception, rather than science, drives decision-making. Alongside those biases comes the availability heuristic. The more often we see certain patterns represented in media, the more natural they feel. Popular films and television portray the strong-jawed, muscular character as the leader, the lanky one as eccentric or intellectual, and the heavier character as comic relief. Those portrayals repeat until they feel like real-world evidence. When meeting someone who happens to fit those outlines, people unconsciously treat the stereotypes as predictive. The abundance of cultural examples makes those biases easier to summon in memory, which tricks the brain into thinking they must be accurate. It's not logic, it's just familiarity dressed up as truth. These shortcuts matter because they slip into real situations that shape lives. In hiring, they surface as first impression bias. Managers often form judgments within seconds of meeting a candidate, influenced not by resume details but by posture, grooming, or size. The same biases that once made somatotypes feel scientific still influence these snap decisions: confirmation bias, halo effect, and availability heuristic. That doesn't mean companies adopt Sheldon's theories, but the underlying psychology remains embedded in how people evaluate others. One practical example: an interviewer might assume that an athletic candidate will handle pressure well, or that a heavier applicant lacks discipline, even though neither conclusion has any reliable basis. The result is discrimination disguised as intuition. Modern research continues to highlight the persistence of these impulses. Studies on hiring practices show managers forming impressions in the first few seconds of contact, often influenced by body size or appearance rather than verified skill. Dating platforms reveal the same effect. Users judge potential partners almost instantly, relying on physical cues as signals of personality. The behavior is consistent across contexts. Bodies are read as windows into identity, even when people know consciously that the assumption has no credibility. The repetition of these biases across workplaces and relationships keeps old categories alive under new forms. Cultural archetypes strengthen the cycle further. Popular media repeats familiar silhouettes so often that audiences internalize their meanings. A muscular lead signals confidence and control. The wiry and awkward figure suggests eccentric brilliance. The heavier sidekick conveys humor or indulgence. After decades of repetition, these roles feel natural, even inevitable. Viewers absorb the patterns passively, and the associations bleed into daily evaluations of real people. Even those who intellectually reject body stereotypes often find themselves influenced by images they have seen thousands of times. Exposure alone creates familiarity, and familiarity mimics validity. At a broader level, the survival of these stereotypes aligns with human history. For much of our past, judging people quickly by appearance may have provided a survival advantage. A stranger's physique seemed to offer clues about strength, vulnerability, or threat. Although conditions have changed, the brain still leans on quick visual judgments because they once made sense. Today, that instinct is misapplied. Modern life demands nuance, not snap sorting, but the tendency remains wired into human cognition. A stripped-down version of the evolutionary story explains why initial impressions feel so intuitive, even though they now produce bias rather than safety. The problem is not just intellectual but behavioral. People already know consciously that stereotypes based on body shape are myths. Psychologists have shown personality is influenced by environment, culture, and choice far more than by physique. Yet the knowledge exists alongside habits that operate automatically. Facing a new person, individuals often revert to assumptions in less than a second. This contradiction reveals the depth of the issue. Awareness of the truth doesn't erase reflexive judgments that feel efficient to the brain. Intellect and instinct clash, and instinct often wins by default. Still, recognizing these biases provides a path forward. Awareness forces people to pause before relying on snap judgments. A hiring manager who catches themselves equating fitness with competence can stop to interrogate the thought and focus on evidence instead. Someone scrolling through online profiles can reflect on what qualities actually matter beyond appearances. None of these steps erase bias entirely, but they slow the process enough to let reason intervene. Over time, repeated pauses become habits, and those habits reshape reflexes. The change is gradual, but it begins with noticing. This kind of reflection uncovers how fragile stereotypes really are. If someone asks why they assumed a tall candidate would make a better manager, or why they read warmth into someone's smile simply because it matched admired features, the stereotype dissolves under the question. Discovering that the links are arbitrary breaks their hold. Once people see those connections as weak, they stop treating them as evidence. Questioning the bias becomes a tool for countering it. Institutional awareness can amplify these individual efforts. Diversity initiatives in workplaces often include training to highlight unconscious bias, reminding interviewers that first impressions are deeply unreliable. Educational programs teach students to recognize how media archetypes exaggerate and distort body image associations. Even dating platforms experiment with shifting emphasis away from photographs to encourage deeper engagement. Each intervention acknowledges that stereotypes are not just myths, but operational habits that need active counterpressure. Tangible changes push culture away from the shortcuts our brains prefer. This pushback connects with cultural movements that reach beyond individual behavior. Body positivity, body neutrality, and related activism appeal to communities precisely because stereotypes are so stubborn. The movements emphasize rejecting the old idea that physique determines worth, insisting instead that identity rests on values, choices, and context. Awareness of bias provides an intellectual foundation, but cultural campaigns supply the momentum to make new habits possible. Together, they counteract a century of assumptions, asking people to see others less through biological outlines and more through lived experience. The persistence of stereotypes ties directly into why social change movements remain urgent. Saying body-based judgments are false is not enough. People need reminders to catch the shortcuts their brains still take. Institutions need pressure to revise the processes that allow discrimination to slip through. Cultural campaigns provide those reminders and pressures, helping individuals and organizations resist old defaults. By confronting stereotypes actively, society builds room for a broader range of people to be valued on their skills, perspectives, and voices rather than appearances. The story of body stereotypes lingering long after their science has collapsed shows both the strength of habit and the possibility of change. Stereotypes survive because they are easy. They simplify a world that is far more complex. But easy does not mean accurate, and once people see the biases for what they are, they can be interrupted and replaced. That replacement requires more than knowledge. It draws on cultural momentum and personal reflection. Both are part of the shift already underway. This raises the next question. If stereotypes survive so stubbornly, what role do modern movements play in pushing back? How can campaigns that challenge old beliefs begin to loosen assumptions that have been repeated for over a century? The rise of body positivity and beyond. Body image activism has grown into one of the most visible cultural forces of the past 2 decades, and its rise has directly confronted the legacy of pseudoscience that once tied physical form to personal worth. Movements like body positivity and body neutrality have expanded the conversation about identity, pushing back against stereotypes that seemed fixed for over a century. Instead of treating physique as evidence of character, these movements argue that value and dignity exist independently of appearance. They have shifted the ground of debate, from asking whether people fit a certain standard, to insisting that shape or size cannot be a measure of human worth. The origins of body positivity can be traced to waves of resistance building across the late 20th century, particularly as commercial beauty culture narrowed the standards of attractiveness throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Fashion, advertising, and film largely pushed images of slim, tall, and often edited figures. Against this, conversations began to take shape in feminist circles, health advocacy, and eventually online communities. By the mid-2000s, the language of body positivity had crystallized, fueled by frustration with exclusion and the harm caused by relentless shaming. Activists highlighted that being left out of representation damaged mental health far more than bodily diversity ever did. Campaigns embraced unapologetic visibility, celebrating bodies considered unprofessional, undesirable, or simply unseen. The demand was simple: worth must never be conditional on compliance with a narrow blueprint. One trigger for this evolution came from the exposure of the very archives Sheldon once drew upon. Alumni outrage in the 1990s, particularly after the Vassar scandal, and the 1995 New York Times Magazine article that revealed Nude university photographs had been kept for decades, added public momentum against the long history of tying student bodies to classification. The backlash not only led institutions to destroy archives, but also underscored just how deeply people mistrusted systems that equated physical form with moral or personal value. That legacy gave additional weight to the arguments of body-positive activists who sought to dismantle those older associations in modern culture. Body neutrality followed a slightly different path in the 2010s and 2020s. Where body positivity encouraged people to actively celebrate their bodies, neutrality offered a quieter option, not centering identity on physical form at all. It resonated particularly with those who found positivity itself demanding, another form of pressure to love or perform appearance. Neutrality instead reframed the body as practical and functional, the vehicle through which people experience life. It stripped away the constant surveillance of looks, lifting the expectation that aesthetics should indicate either virtue or flaw. For those exhausted by cycles of comparison, neutrality provided a way to live inside a body without evaluation or defense. These ideas have gradually filtered into broader settings. Schools that once reinforced posture-based discipline shifted their programming toward mental health, nutrition, and inclusive practices. Classroom walls that once displayed messages equating upright posture with personal strength now place more emphasis on collaboration, practice, and resilience. Assemblies highlight body diversity rather than equating discipline with thinness or athleticism. In workplaces, wellness campaigns began to ease away from messages centered exclusively on weight and instead embraced language about energy, balance, and stress reduction. Diversity programs often include body image as a point of inclusion, acknowledging that exclusion still carries economic as well as emotional costs. The transition reflects a recognition that the body is not a moral ledger. Advertising, traditionally a chief enforcer of body ideals, has also been influenced. Facing both activist critique and consumer demand, many brands now incorporate a broader range of models across size, ability, ethnicity, and age. Classic marketing tropes of mesomorphic leadership figures gave way slowly but measurably to campaigns presenting variation. Though the shift has been uneven and criticized as selective, the cumulative effect has altered public imagery. Representation does matter. Research shows that when children and young adults see leaders and role models of varied forms, their tendency to reduce people to physique weakens. They learn to describe others in terms of skill, creativity, or humor rather than weight or outline. Incrementally, visual contradiction interrupts stereotypes that had otherwise passed unquestioned. Still, activism does not erase bias completely. Many critics note how quickly corporate campaigns co-opt body positivity for commercial purposes. Selective imagery, carefully curated social media influencers, or advertisements featuring only acceptable versions of diversity reveal how easily ideals are commodified. While representation expands, it can remain bound by profit motives rather than deeper commitments. Viewers may celebrate a wider range of figures in marketing, yet bias in workplaces, schools, and personal relationships continues. What matters, then, is not only the expansion of imagery, but also the persistence of individual and institutional practices that avoid reverting to older hierarchies. Spiritual perspectives bring another dimension. Where Sheldon's system claimed physique dictated inner traits, many traditions insist the opposite. Essence is not constrained by form. Religious or philosophical thought often describes the body as a vessel, an instrument through which character or consciousness acts but never defined by it. Scars, variations, or disabilities are seen as part of a broader human story, not as verdicts. This lens radically contradicts the determinism of constitutional psychology. Where pseudoscience sought to rank and categorize, spiritual views encourage humility, recognizing the body as context but not command. For many, that reframing offers a grounding principle that aligns with the work of modern body image campaigns. The key effect of both body positivity and neutrality rests on this decoupling of appearance and value. They challenge the reflex to read surface as essence. Socially, they press back against workplaces or industries that reward only narrow presentations. Personally, they encourage people to see their lived experience as unbound from outline. Spiritually, they remind us that embodiment carries, but does not define inner worth. Together, these layers weaken the long echo of older theories by training new expectations, ones where diversity feels ordinary and stereotype no longer appears natural. Yet movements alone cannot dissolve the reflexive habits shaped by history. Campaigns build awareness, but daily interactions test whether those lessons endure. A teacher may present body diverse examples in class, yet still harbor unconscious bias about which student looks like a leader. A hiring manager may endorse inclusivity, yet still conflate physical fitness with competence. Awareness campaigns are scaffolding, personal practice is the structure. Without conscious habits, reflexive stereotypes can reassert themselves in subtle ways. Practical strategies then become crucial. Studies indicate that mindfulness and deliberate reflection reduce reliance on stereotypes when making judgments. Even small disruptions to automatic thinking can shift outcomes. Pausing for a moment before forming an impression, asking a clarifying question, or checking which evidence actually supports an evaluation introduces a wedge between bias and action. This personal element ensures that cultural progress is not just symbolic but lived. That is where modern activism reconnects with individual responsibility. Body positivity and neutrality expand the field of imagination, but ordinary acts of awareness reinforce the new environment. Movements alter imagery in classrooms, businesses, advertising, and spiritual communities, but people themselves carry those lessons into choices and conversations. When workplaces emphasize contribution over physique, schools celebrate body diversity, and individuals practice hesitation before judgment, the culture shifts one interaction at a time. Try this the next time you meet someone new. Pause your instinctive impression. Instead of weighing posture, shape, or presentation, ask one open question about their interests or work. Focus your attention on what they say rather than what they look like in the first 5 seconds. That tiny adjustment makes space for identity to reveal itself without body-based framing. It is a simple tool, but multiplied across countless interactions, it weakens the grip of centuries-old habits. By combining activism, institutional reform, and personal practice, society continues to edge away from body-based determinism. Campaigns provide visibility, individuals strengthen habits, and institutions redesign environments that once reinforced stereotypes. Together, they build a framework where form is no longer mistaken for essence. This shift matters because the deepest lessons of history are not only about science that failed, but about the choices we make after learning how fragile truth can be. Those choices extend beyond culture into personal growth, inviting reflection on what kind of wisdom we can take forward. Lessons for spiritual growth and daily wisdom. What spiritual lessons can be drawn from the history of posture photos and somatotypes? The story is not only about scientific error, but also about how easy it is to confuse appearance with essence. For decades, shoulders, waistlines, and body outlines were treated as moral and psychological evidence. The mistake reminds us how tempting it is to project inequalities onto external form. That same temptation continues today, which is why the episode offers practical reminders for growth, not just intellectual lessons, but ways to live with clearer perception and deeper wisdom. From a spiritual perspective, one principle comes forward immediately. The body may carry signs of what it has endured, but it never dictates the nature of the soul. A scar may point to an old injury, a curve might register years of habit, wrinkles reflect the passage of time. Yet none of these marks explain character, kindness, or intention. They are traces of a journey, not predictions of destiny. When we confuse those traces for a map, identity becomes flattened, as if people could be read like charts. Sheldon's mistake was to mistake posture for temperament. The ongoing lesson is to learn the difference between surface marks and inner life. Applied to everyday living, this lesson means practicing restraint before turning appearance into judgment. Someone standing with square shoulders may be patient and introverted, while another who appears hesitant in stance may be strong in action once given voice. Labels are often wrong at first glance. Growth begins by catching ourselves when assumptions form. A simple practice helps. Pause, recognize the bias, and ask if the impression belongs to them or to our interpretation. That pause opens the possibility of curiosity rather than assumption, shifting the frame from "I know who this person is" to "I wonder who they might be." Curiosity leaves space for authentic connection. Modern psychology provides sounder tools for understanding behavior. Today, personality models like the Big Five, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotional stability, are more defensible. Unlike Sheldon's body charts, the Big Five requires structured questionnaires, not snap visual judgments. It recognizes people as multidimensional and ever-changing, measured through tendencies and patterns rather than silhouettes. Mentioning models like these reminds us that real science builds methods to resist bias, not to legitimize it. At the same time, spiritual awareness does not rely solely on academic models. Mindfulness remains one of the most effective tools for disarming bias. Biases act automatically, so the remedy must interrupt that automation. A pause before reacting, even a single breath, can slow the reflex to categorize. That pause makes the unseen mental leap visible, giving the freedom to accept or reject it. With practice, that pause becomes a steady habit, creating space where stereotypes once dictated action. Within that space, choice becomes possible, choice to question, to hold judgment back, to listen. Simple practices can make this process easier. 3 micro-practices stand out: pause and question. Take a breath and ask a single clarifying question before forming a judgment. Report, don't assume. Base judgments on observable actions or words, not appearances. Reframe with humor. Call out the absurdity of linking shoulders or waistlines with trustworthiness. Each of these strategies directly interrupts the biases research shows most people carry. They are small shifts, but over time they replace automatic projection with deliberate perception. Humor especially lightens the practice. Imagine choosing close friends by thigh measurements or dismissing someone's loyalty because their posture slouched. The comedy of the image shows how empty those biases really are. Humor breaks the spell of seriousness that stereotypes often carry. It reveals illusions as illusions, stripping them of power. In daily life, laughing at a bias makes it easier to drop it, reminding us that sincerity, care, and honesty never depended on physical outline. Practicing awareness in this way is more than a mental exercise. It is also an act of liberation. When we refuse to define ourselves by form or define others by it, we reclaim perception from a system that once insisted on control. In Sheldon's framework, posture dictated personality. In mindful awareness, personality is revealed through action, choice, and spirit rather than measured outlines. The lesson is about refusing shortcuts. By rejecting appearance as destiny, we restore the ability to meet people freshly, without imposed categories, and without mistaking their frame for their nature. Personal growth, then, requires turning the lesson inward as much as outward. We must outgrow the stereotypes we impose, but also the ones we carry against ourselves. For decades, somatotype categories declared people limited from the start. Inner growth replaces those prescriptions with new questions. Who am I becoming through choice and relationship? What values shape my path? With those questions, form becomes secondary. Character, decision, and resilience matter more than bone structure or waistline. Letting go of the old charts clears a view of what actually defines us. Facing this clearly is not effortless. On a personal level, it requires admitting how often reflexive judgments still surface. On a collective level, it requires acknowledging how institutions once sanctioned those biases and betrayed trust. Both pieces of honesty are needed, admitting the shadow within ourselves and remembering the history of misplaced authority outside ourselves. Growth is rarely comfortable. But discomfort clarifies perception, and clarity allows freedom from patterns that moved unnoticed in the past. The lesson, then, is not only archival but practical. It points to the responsibility of learning how to see and how to listen. Bodies express experience but do not dictate essence. Recognizing the difference prevents us from repeating errors dressed as science. Practice daily that recognition replaces stereotype with compassion. Growth lives in this space, aware of our own biases and gentle toward the differences of others. Compassion without awareness risks vagueness. Awareness without compassion risks distance. Combined, they undo illusions and invite genuine connection. In daily practice, these lessons can be applied in simple steps. Try the pause and question method the next time you meet someone. Take a breath before the first word leaves your mouth and ask yourself what judgment forms spontaneously. If you recognize it, press pause and stay curious. If you try this experiment, share the experience in the comments. Whether it felt awkward or freeing, describing it helps underline how quickly old habits operate. That personal reflection is itself the start of practice. Personal history and collective history converge here. Institutions once declared that appearance explained identity. Individuals now have a chance to undo that conditioning through mindful choices in daily life. With each act of refusing shortcuts, with each pause before judgment, we push back against systems that once went unquestioned. The lesson of Sheldon's posture projects becomes not only what to avoid but what to practice: presence, patience, and curiosity. The benefits extend beyond fairness to others. Observing rather than assuming teaches us what we really value, qualities like persistence, honesty, or kindness. When we reorient attention toward these traits, perception sharpens. We no longer confuse quick impressions with real understanding. This inversion of focus strengthens daily wisdom. It reminds us who we want to be and how we want to see others. Spiritual growth comes from the steady act of separating essence from form, intention from outline. Over time, that practice becomes second nature. Micro-practices, mindfulness, curiosity, and humor together make a toolkit that anyone can use. These are not abstract philosophies, but living practices that reshape how perception unfolds moment to moment. Sheldon's theory offered neat but erroneous shortcuts. Real wisdom emerges not from shortcuts, but from choosing to notice, question, and engage. When seen this way, growth is not a grand destination, but an ongoing series of deliberate choices. This is why the posture photo story matters. It reminds us how fragile truth can be when science lacks consent and society mistakes appearance for evidence. The lesson reaches past archives into daily behavior, showing that awareness and compassion can rebuild perception, where pseudoscience once claimed control. The same history that warns of error also urges responsibility in how we see others today. And it is this reminder, the danger of mistaking outer for inner, that brings us to the broader conclusion of the story. The story comes to a close with a sharp reminder. Institutional authority can enable the misuse of science, and appearance never equals essence. Bodies cannot serve as personality maps, no matter how convincing the charts once looked. That lesson is both historical and personal, because the instinct to judge by form lingers long after the theory has vanished. Here's the challenge. This week, pause when you catch yourself making a quick impression and ask one genuine curiosity question instead. Share in the comments if you've ever overturned a snap judgment. You may discover others have too.